Now, a lot of what happens in the South really depends upon the railroad, and that's very important. When I say it's important, it's because the Southern network of railroads expands even more rapidly than does the national network of railroads after the Civil War. This expansion is one of the factors, I think, that heightens the capacity of investment and new industry as it moves into the South. As far as these industries go, let me go ahead and move through just a few of them. Perhaps the most important industry in this New South was what we might call forest products, timber. And just to give you one example, that could include the hardwoods of the South, trees that were like oak, poplar, or other hardwood trees, but also softwood trees like the yellow pine that grew particularly in the Deep South. And just to give you some idea of harvest, in 1869, following the Civil War, you had in the South harvested approximately 1.5 billion board feet. And that's a measurement of how much actual useful wood, you're going to get out of any tree trunk. 1.5 billion board feet in 1869. By 1899, 30 years later, over 9.7 billion board feet was harvested in the South. By 1900, timber products, things like sawmills and lumberjacking, employed 1/5 of all Southern industrial workers. 1/5 worked in milling or harvesting timber. This extended beyond just, the basic milling to some industries in the South that actually produced manufactured products from the resource that was harvested. So, for instance, we see the development in the South of a furniture industry in places like North Carolina. And then we also see pulp and paper industries made from the cut wood. Another important industry in the South is iron and ultimately steel. I mentioned in another lecture the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, which was certainly one of the finest before and during the Civil War. But after the war, Northern investment and the expansion of railroads provides access not only to timber resources and their rapid exploitation, but also to mineral ores like iron ores that exist particularly within the so-called Mountain South. The most important years for the iron industry probably precede in the South, when you really stop and think about it, precede the exploitation of the Mesabi Range up in the northern United States near the Great Lakes, where you have a new access to iron ores. So that Southern ores are perhaps most important in the 1870s and into the 1880s, 90s somewhat, and then less so by the 20th century. But just to give you an example, one of the most important iron-producing cities in the South will be Birmingham, Alabama, a city which is by and large created by the presence of coal resources and iron ore in proximity to one another, and access to railroads, among them, of course, the Louisville and Nashville Road. By the 1870s, the early 1870s, Birmingham is being developed into a center for the production of pig irons and into a sort of, beginning its process of growing into an urban center within the South where the needs of workers can be met. By about 1907, Birmingham and its steel production has come under the control of the new great trust, the U.S. Steel. And so Birmingham will produce some steel as well as just iron, but it will do so at a disadvantage. And you'll often hear historians talking about the so-called shipping rate differentials that existed that gave distinct advantages to companies up north in places like Pennsylvania and elsewhere when it came to shipping southern iron or steel in particular that could compete with northern produced iron and steel. Nonetheless, throughout the South, we see considerable amounts of iron, less steel because of the differentials like Pittsburgh Plus or the so-called Birmingham differential, which made it more expensive to ship steel out of Birmingham. But we do see a great deal of iron production in the South. That iron, of course, required coal or coke to heat furnaces. In the antebellum period, there had been an iron industry in the South, but increasingly after the Civil War, the shift that occurs is towards steel when it can be manufactured, but also a shift toward what fuel is used. Before the war, you see an awful lot of wood being used to fire furnaces. After the war, you see more and more coal, and more particularly a processed version of coal called coke, which burns very hot with less exhaust. What this led to, of course, was the opening of coal mines in the South. Now, there were mines in place in Pennsylvania in the so-called anthracite areas. There would be mining out in the American West, but the South, too, participated in this growing segment of Southern industrialization by harvesting or exploiting seams of bituminous coal in particular in the mountains of the southern region. And I'll add to this quickly, though I'm not going to say a lot about it, that one of the great new fuels of the Gilded Age of that late 19th century industrialization would be petroleum products like oil. You may remember, of course, John D. Rockefeller and kerosene and the refining of these petroleum products. That's another major kind of industry that develops in the South in places like Texas and Louisiana as oil reserves. Once oil is discovered up north in Pennsylvania and it becomes known that there are reserves in the South, we begin to see the development of oil during this period of the New South. So, just to review really quickly, so far we've talked about timber products, we've talked about iron, we've talked about coal, and we've talked a bit, just briefly, about sort of the birth of petroleum assets. Another element or piece of the industrial puzzle of the New South is tobacco. Tobacco we think of course, in terms of agriculture. It's a crop to be grown. But the tobacco industry in the South was really quite important because it was one of those industries where manufacturing occurred within the region, sort of like the furniture industry or textiles. In other words, it's not just about the harvesting of resources, but it is about producing an item that has value added attached to it. And that's more unusual among Southern industries. The story of tobacco very quickly is in some ways the story of families. And to give you an example, one of these families would be the family of James Buchanan Buck Duke, who made a fortune, much like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Morgans of the world, but he made his fortune in tobacco. Technology had a role. He had acquired in the 1880s license to a particular machine that could produce cigarettes. Previously, cigarettes had been handmade. Well, once he buys the license to this machine, known as the Bonsack machine, he was able then to more efficiently produce cigarettes in volume. The problem he had, of course, was how do you create a market for these cigarettes that I can produce so many of? I mean, how am I going to produce a market where people will be able to buy the volume I can make? And what he ultimately does is turn to advertising. Some of the earliest and greatest advertising campaigns or marketing campaigns are bound up with the sale of cigarettes, or more particularly, convincing Americans that they ought to smoke cigarettes, a question which, of course, continued to be part of the discussion of the United States through the 20th century and into the 21st. What's the role of government, after all, in regulating something that has danger to a human being? Well, that wasn't exactly the question that was being asked, though it actually sort of was being asked in the late 19th century by some people, how dangerous the cigarette was. But James Buchanan Duke, Buck Duke is what he's often referred to as, would start a monopoly, or a trust is more accurate, the American Tobacco Company, which stretched internationally to control the production of tobacco goods, cigarettes, chewing tobacco, other forms in which tobacco was sold and marketed. It's Buck Duke, one of the kind of brilliant industrialists and marketers, who sees how you bring all the pieces from production to sale or marketing together to move product. And just to throw in, because this is, we'll call this extra, won't charge for this. When we think about, in the United States, we think about baseball cards, and often, certainly when I was younger, baseball cards appeared in packs of bubble gum. But some of the first cards that were intended to entice people, including kids, to purchase a product, many of those first cards were actually included along with cigarettes or tobacco products. Buck Duke, for instance, includes some of the first baseball cards in cigarette packs, and also will include series that are historical in nature, major American historical figures, and also celebrities, especially singers and dancers, female, oftentimes, that had come from the stage, but in modern America had come to be known broadly, thanks in part to mass media. Probably not the largest, but certainly one of the most important Southern industries to develop during the New South was the Southern textile industry. It had existed before the war in a very limited form, but by 1880, the South could claim over 32,000 spindles. And if you think about how textile manufacturing works, you're using thread, and that thread will be on a bobbin or spindle. Over 32,000 spindles by 1880, and a capital investment of over $11 million. Well, to give you some basis for comparison, by 1905, the South could claim about 110,000 spindles and a capital investment of around $125 million. The growth in the number and the level of investment in textile manufacturing in the South was just amazing. Indeed, if we move a little further in time, by the 1920s, the South will surpass New England in terms of textile production within the United States. The way textile mills worked was fascinating because they were often accompanied, as had been the case in New England, by the textile mill village. In the South, often it was farm families, Southern families, who struggled in agriculture, who made the move into industry. They made the move to the coal mines. They made the move to the timber industry. Sometimes they supplemented farm income with work in these industries. But when it came to the textile industry, it meant often moving an entire family to the mill village and to work in the mills. So when we talk about Southern industry, it's not just the businesses, it's not just the factories, but as with the social change that accompanies agricultural change, it's also a social change that we're really talking about. The family wage system that's incorporated into the mills and is connected then with life in the mill village means that whole families came into Southern textiles. Men, women, husbands, wives, children, came in to work in these factories. Often discipline was maintained over children by their own fathers when they were on the factory floor. And it was not uncommon for children of a very young age to be called upon to work to supplement family income. And if that tells you anything, I suppose it suggests how much a struggle agricultural life in this New South was, that families were willing to go to the mill and put their children to work in factories. On the other side of that equation, there were opportunities in these mills and mill villages that simply didn't exist on the farm, where life was constantly a struggle. One of the major benefits of working in a mill, a textile mill, was a regular paycheck, that one could avoid the sorts of ups and downs that come with farming and the constant struggle for capital and for money. So I guess what I want to leave you with here, having talked now about agriculture and in this last lecture about industry, is that sort of understanding that in both agriculture and in industry, what changes technologically, what changes in terms of capital markets, which isn't so much in the end because much capital comes from outside the South before and after the Civil War. Nonetheless, what does change has a social element about it. And yet, and this is the argument that I would make, and yet for all the change that you see taking place in the South, there are some elements of Southern life that don't change so very much. Here's what I mean. Yes, there are new relationships that develop in terms of agriculture. Yes, there are new relationships, new industries that develop in the New South industrially. But if you think about it in terms of the social structure and the relationships of power, you still have in the South the people on top and the people on the bottom, economically, financially, socially. You still have these delineations of class and of caste that you had before the Civil War. For African Americans, there were limited areas where they could participate in the new industrial economy, limited opportunities within the South for them to actually leave agriculture and what bound them to agriculture in terms of debt, peonage. That's a cultural question. In other words, there was nothing economic per se. There was nothing that prevented them inherently from making an economic move. It was just the case that textiles, for instance, were not open to African American workers. There were limited opportunities for African Americans in the mines, and mining coal, for instance. There were opportunities, though few, in iron production and in other jobs. My point, and it's a point that other historians have made far better than I would, I suppose, is that many of the relationships that existed before the war, planters, for instance, and the yeomen, lower class whites, will continue to exist after the war. A journalist, way back in 1941, put forward an argument in a book known as The Mind of the South, and this journalist was, his name was W.J. Cash, and he argued that in fundamental ways, the idea of a new South was improper. That those who had controlled industry and controlled agriculture before the Civil War resumed under different auspices, under different mechanisms, the same control they had enjoyed before the war. So before the war, after the war, for W.J. Cash, it didn't much matter. The surface had changed. The way things were done, yeah, maybe that changed. the types of industry, the focus on industrialization, yes, maybe that had changed. Larger cities, yes, maybe that had changed. But in terms of who owned the New South, Cash said, not so very different, is it, from the people that owned the Old South?